I've just started recording. Whoever is the host, can you please make sure that the person who's speaking is pinned? Because I don't seem to be host anymore. Right. If everyone's ready, I'm going to start the webinar now. Welcome, everyone. We'll just give a minute for people to join. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to the second EPI-WIN CSO webinar of this year. This is on the WHO guidance on evidence for community protection in public health emergencies, the CSO perspectives. Today, I will like to just provide the housekeeping, and then I will hand over to our technical lead for this webinar, Dr. Nina Gobat, who leads on evidence for community protection. But before that, I'd like to welcome all of you warmly and let you know that we do have this webinar being recorded. We also have interpretation in French. So if you go to the bottom of the Zoom mode and go to select the interpretation that you need and listen to it there. Please introduce yourself in the chat. For those of you who are familiar with EPI-WIN, we'd love to hear from you. So please tell us your name, which organization you're from, and also which country. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have any insights that you'd like to add, please add it in the chat. But if you have any questions, and I hope you do, please add it in the Q&A section so that we can answer it. We can keep track of it. And finally, please keep all conversations positive, respectful, and to the topic. We're here as a community. We're here to learn from each other. Let's all keep it positive. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to request Dr. Nina Gobat to take the floor and introduce all the speakers and tell us more about this webinar. Over to you, Nina.
Many thanks, Supriya, and a very warm welcome to you all from me. As Supriya said, I'm a technical officer and senior technical officer at the Community Protection and Resilience Unit, and evidence and analytics for community protection is part of the portfolio that I lead. So it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming our panelists as well as our opening speakers to this event. This is a very important event for us to hear the CSO perspective on normative products that we are developing. To open the webinar, I'd first like to introduce our director, Dr. Nadret Emiroglu, who's the director of the Emergencies Core Capability Department at WHO's Health Emergencies Program, to welcome you all and say a few words. Nadret, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Thanks for joining us at this important event that we give high priority to working with the communities. So the views of the civil society and community-based organizations are critically important for us. And I'm happy to be engaged in this second webinar, and I thank the teams at WHO who are preparing for it, and we have been working very intensively to ensure to work and engage and work with, work for, work together with the communities. I think it's a standard description we have is that everything starts at the communities and everything ends at the communities. So the first recognition, the first detection, and also the last case and the last interventions are happening at the communities. So we see this as a critical element of the new thinking in health emergencies at every emergency management cycle, from starting with the prevention, which is critically important, but also being prepared and being ready to respond, as well as at the recovery. So the communities are at the center of all these work for related to health emergencies. And we would like to, of course, learn from you as the first responders, the organizations working with the communities, the individual leaders, the specific, you would know the specific needs and the way to reach out to those communities better than us. Unfortunately, as you know, the size, scale, and complexity of health emergencies are increasing. And we would like to have a broad, inclusive partnership at all levels, at the global, regional, national, and at the community level, using WHO's setting norms, standard policies, as well as convening advantages. We would like to bring all the relevant agencies, organizations, stakeholders together to be able to develop the guidance that you may need. So we would like to hear from you on what your needs are in order for WHO to produce all that evidence and science-based guidance, which is going to be impactful, lead to impactful interventions that lead to the response in the communities, and it will be relevant and adaptable, acceptable to the different contexts within that affected community. And there's no one else who knows that better for us. So today I'm really looking forward to hearing from you within a two-way conversation with you, with the civil society and the community-based groups in producing this evidence and or using available evidence in the work. So you can guide us on how we could develop some of the interventions, programs, advocacy needed to reach out to communities or deliver the health and public health services they need, or the medical countermeasures, prevention interventions, public health and social measures. So there are so many relevant interventions that we could save lives. So that's as part of our priority within the global health emergency architecture and the framework. So one of the biggest priority systems within this framework is community protection and resilience, where just building the science, working with all the stakeholders, and bringing the communities in co-developing and leading the way they would like to manage the emergencies is a central element within the emergency work. So I'm really looking forward to hear your experience, your guidance, and this is one of the other consultations we will have in the future. We would like to make this as a regular way of communicating with you, hearing from you, to be able to support you better, be closer to the communities where the needs are. And this is the start of a number of serious actions we will be taking also in the future. And it has important consequences, of course, in our work while we're developing the scope and context of the normative guidance for this work, which is one of the major mandates of WHO. So thanks very much, and back to you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Nedret, for those very warm words of welcome and those very wise words of welcome to frame this important consultation. And looking at the chat, I'm seeing the number of people introducing themselves, and it's really impressive to see the breadth and diversity of folks who've gathered together here on the call. So thank you for your participation. As you know, the main focus of our conversation today is to think about normative guidance that WHO is developing for evidence and analytics to strengthen our work in community protection and resilience. And to give us some framing around what that strategic context looks like, I'd like to introduce our unit head for the Community Protection and Resilience Unit, Dr. Kai van Harbu, to talk on what do we mean by community protection. Kai, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nina. And also from my side, thank you very much, Nedret, for these welcoming remarks and also for setting the stage so well. And also, of course, thanks to Supriya for organizing this very important meeting. I think it's really important to have this dedicated space today to hear from CSOs and from community-based organizations about how we generate and use evidence to strengthen community protection in health emergencies. And this consultation is really a very, very important step in the development process of this new WHO normative guidance that Nedret spoke already about, related to evidence for community protection. And it's so important for us because we think that it will strengthen the relevance of the document, but also the ethical quality and the practical impact of how we can use community data in emergency settings, because we all know that during emergencies, we have very limited time. There's usually overwhelming need, and many of the most affected communities are also the hardest to reach. This is why we really need to understand how people and communities experience crises and what shapes their decisions and what support they need. And that kind of understanding we don't receive from surveillance data or lab data alone. It's really important to gather the community evidence, and that needs to be gathered in real time, often by the community actors and in particular by civil society groups like you, who are the most trusted and who are present even before the emergency. this is why it's so important that we hear from you how to develop this guidance in the best way. And we have a lot of experience, most recently from MPOX, which is an ongoing public health emergency of international concern. In all of the affected countries, we see on a daily basis how the civil society organizations are engaged and are really leading efforts around tracking community concerns and adapting risk communication, ensuring that the vulnerable groups are consulted, and also feeding back this information to the national health authorities, and then ensuring that this influences decision making. And this is so important for us in this guidance. We want this to be operationally relevant and really reach the decision maker. This is, I think, what is oftentimes still the missing link around that. So what we really want to hear today from you, what can we make, how can we ensure that evidence is trustworthy and usable in your work as well as civil society organizations? How can this guidance support the real-time, ethical and inclusive data collection? And how can we co-create tools and systems that support both communities and the decision makers? And for us in the community protection unit, civil societies play a critical role. Nadette spoke a lot about already about the importance of community protection as part of our HEPA framework. It's a central component, and we are working to ensure that this is not just rhetoric, that this is put into practice. And this is a long time effort, of course, but civil society organizations play a central role in this. This is why we are building this platform to consult with CSOs on an ongoing basis, both in the preparedness phase on topics like this one, but also for dedicated briefings in specific emergency response operations, like many of you attended in the past. So I want to thank you again for being there today. I really look forward to your input, and we will continue to stay in touch, and there will be many more opportunities to engage with you. Thank you, and back to you, Nina.
Thanks very much, Kai. And thanks very much for setting the stage and the framing for the importance of this area of work. I'm going to say a few words on the focus of the guidance, and then I'm going to introduce our panel to hear from the panel themselves. So the guidance itself is focused on both the production and the use of evidence, really to strengthen community-centered practice. And both Kai and Nadret have spoken to what that means and what that looks like. The kinds of contexts we would expect this kind of evidence to be useful for are quite broad and varied. So we would be thinking really about multiple hazards. We would be thinking about not only infectious disease outbreaks, but also things like extreme weather events. We would also be thinking, of course, that in many instances, there are parts of the world that are experiencing multiple crises at the same time. And that term polycrisis has very often been used. If you look at an emergency from the bottom up, very often people are living with multiple hazards and having to juggle multiple priorities, multiple pieces of information coming toward them. And I think this is the opportunity for co-development, is really to start to say, how can we look at things differently so that our solutions are really workable at local levels? So I'd like to introduce our panelists who are working actively in this space and thank them again for their time for joining us. Patrick Ockwin is the research team lead at EBASE in Cameroon. Carolyn Lidston-Jones is the CEO at Indigenous Primary Healthcare Council in Canada. And Cesar Mombunza is the national coordinator of the Congo Network of Religious Leaders living with or personally affected by HIV and AIDS. So a very warm welcome to the three of you. And Patrick, I'm going to turn to you to open the panel, to ask you to say a few words about EBASE and your experience, your organization's experience with producing and using evidence in your work. Patrick, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina, and thank you, Nedred and Dr. Kai for the opening statements. So at EBASE, we use Toride, which is a storytelling approach to communicate evidence, but also to generate evidence. And in the process of actually communicating the evidence, we can gather experiences that will reflect the impact of behavior change, improvement in knowledge, and all the others. And the reason why we are where we are was because we were responding to a challenge that we were facing, which was some of the challenges that Dr. Kai mentioned, which was how can we have ethical community engagement, and how can we bring about things that are coming from the context? Because when there is emergencies, the kind of evidence that we need is actually evidence that's coming from that community, that can be generated from that community. So our work at eBase actually focuses on using Toride as an approach for disseminating research evidence, which can help to address things around disinformation, misinformation, and also existing myths in one part. But it's also used to actually gather experiences, lived experiences from people in their communities through the stories of their lives and their exposures to crisis or other things. So this is what we do at eBase in a nutshell.
Patrick, thank you so much. And that term lived experience as a source of evidence, I think is absolutely critical and something we should return to. But Caroline, I'm going to turn to you to ask you from your perspective, speaking from your organization's perspective, to what extent do you produce and use evidence? And do you have any recent examples you could share with us? Over to you.
So I actually took the time to step back and think about how do we actually even define evidence. So my organization works with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, so the Indigenous peoples of Canada. I'm First Nation myself, but being able to center how we ourselves define something. And so I'm actually going to read something that we developed, and I don't normally read, but I wanted to really crystallize what our thoughts were. So from our perspective, so located in Canada, evidence is defined as the diverse, interwoven, and contextually grounded knowledge that informs, guides, and transforms Indigenous holistic health systems. This includes, but is not limited to, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, community-led research, oral histories, land-based teachings, lived experiences, similar to my colleague and what he was sharing, ethical, empirical inquiry, or observed realities, the realities of what people face on a day-to-day basis. Evidence is relational, rooted in self-determination, and governed through Indigenous principles of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relevance. And I think so. One of the things that I would share in some of the examples that we use, I'm often invited in to be guest lecturers. And I recently went into one of our medical schools in Canada, and they were talking about evidence as going to be new doctors going out into our communities and servicing our communities and working with some of the individual people that we have in our communities. And so one of the questions that I pose, because we often think of scientific empirical evidence as the truth for everyone. So the question that I posed to them was, have you ever lived your evidence? And oftentimes I get people very quiet in that response. And I said, so really, what does that tell you? It tells us the disconnect a lot of times between the things we study and our actual human experience, that we're more than just a study, or we're more than just a research study, and being able to center that. And so one of the things that I shared in that experience with the students that I was with, I said, okay, we talk about peer reviewed. I said, for us, it's peer remembered. And what does peer remembered mean? Peer remembered means it's stuff that our grandmothers taught us, our aunties, our uncles, our community members, our leaders in our communities. It's our blood memory. And people don't realize through our blood memory We often talk about things, how trauma is received, how it's passed through generations, how we actually have a lived experience through, as you mentioned, polycrisis and having many things happening to the community at any given time. And so I think that it was important for us to talk about that from the actual human experience. And what does that mean? So I just share that because I think it helps us to ground sometimes the empirical side and that very scientific approach that we have in doing things versus the very lived real experience that you have in that. So how do we produce evidence? Similar to my colleague sharing, we do a lot of oral storytelling and documenting that. So letting people tell their own stories. We don't need to tell it for them. They can tell their own stories. We do storyboarding circles. We do consultation with our knowledge keepers and people who hold a lot of our traditional information in communities of how they used to handle emergencies and how they used to respond, what worked well, what didn't work well. We also use frameworks like stories of strength. And I love how we centered the conversation in the beginning to talk about it from a strength perspective and to be kind to each other. Because in emergencies, it is so important to be kind to each other and not to lose that community perspective that these are people's lives that we're talking about. And in some cases, life and death, and being able to be kind with each other. So those are some of the things that we do to help center some of the work that we do in the creation of it, as well as how do we use the evidence. So a lot of that I'll share in our next question of how we actually use that evidence to inform what we do.
Caroline, thank you so much. So there's such powerful reflections and you know, the process that we followed to get to this point of saying what we want is guidance on evidence for community protection, you know, was not without influence from some of those kinds of ideas. You know, previously in our MPOX response, we developed guidance for research. And we had a lot of discussion in our guidance development group about the terms that we're using and how that term research can sometimes limit and delegitimize many different forms of evidence that need to come to decision-making tables. So we have expanded and you know, our thinking around that. And I think such important reflections really from you that I think we need to take forward into that guidance and think about, well, what does that really mean? How do we operationalize that? And how do we make sure that the evidence that comes to decision makers has the legitimacy and the visibility that it needs? So thank you so much for sharing that perspective. I'm going to come now to César, and I'm going to ask César a similar question based on your work in Konola, particularly in DRC, but on the African continent. You know, what is your experience related to producing and using community-based evidence? César, over to you.
Merci beaucoup pour la parole. Notre organisation travaille spécifiquement pour les leaders religieux et surtout dans le cadre de la lutte contre la stigmatisation et la discrimination. Et dans ce cadre-là, nous travaillons pour rechercher à documenter les cas de la stigmatisation et de la discrimination des personnes vivant avec des VSDA dans leur communauté, dans les milieux de soins. Et nous avons des expériences plus capitales que nous avons essayé de produire les données. La première chose, c'était de produire les données sur la stigmatisation et la discrimination liées à l'orientation sexuelle dans les milieux de cultes, dans la ville de Kinshasa. Pourquoi nous avons recherché ces données? Parce que nous avons senti qu'il y a la communauté LGBTI qui était stigmatisée, discriminée dans les milieux de confessions, dans les milieux de cultes, alors que ce sont des personnes qui voulaient expérimenter leur vie spirituelle. Et ces données ont été des traits capitales. Des traits capitales, pourquoi? Parce que ces données nous ont montré que la majorité des personnes qui stigmatisent, qui discriminent, c'était des responsables de confessions religieuses. Et ces données nous ont permis que nous puissions mener des actions. Et parce que nous sommes dans la communauté. Nous, c'est de rechercher comment nous pouvons trouver solution à nos problèmes qui nous touchent directement. Et par rapport à cette donnée-là, qui montrait que les personnes qui sont les plus bourreaux ou qui sont les plus personnes qui stigmatisent, c'était des responsables de confession. Nous avions essayé d'organiser ce qu'on appelle les dialogues entre les leaders religieux et la communauté LGBTI et aussi essayer d'organiser des dialogues entre des communautés pour vivre ensemble. Et voilà comment nous travaillons avec nos données pour essayer de trouver des réponses d'une manière communautaire, d'une manière directe. La deuxième expérience qui est plus frappante pour nous, c'était la stigmatisation des personnes vivant avec le VIH-Sida dans plusieurs milieux et surtout dans les milieux des soins. Nous avons constaté que nous, les communautaires, nous, les personnes qui sont touchées par les VIH, lorsque nous exploitons les centres de santé, lorsque nous exploitons euh, nos milieux sociaux, nous sommes stigmatisés. Mais la stigmatisation que nous avons découverte dans les milieux de soins a été plus pondérante et c'est une stigmatisation qui faisait un frein pour que nous ne puissions pas avancer dans notre adhérence au traitement, notre prise en charge. Et c'est à travers ces données-là qui ont montré qu'il y a la stigmatisation dans les milieux des soins, nous avons essayé de produire des actions. La première action, c'était de former les professionnels des soins sur la stigmatisation, sur les droits humains. Parce que souvent, nous pensons que les professionnels des soins connaissent les diatologies, connaissent beaucoup de choses. Mais les droits humains, de temps en temps, nous remarquons que ça manque. Donc voilà, à peu de mots, comment nous, à notre niveau, étant que des communautés, étant que des personnes qui sont touchées, qui sont des premières barrières par les maladies, nous avons produit des données et nous n'avons pas mis ces données-là dans les tiroirs, comme vous venez de dire. Ces données-là, nous les avons utilisées en faisant des actions pour essayer de pallier à ces problèmes-là. Voilà les deux grandes expériences par rapport à nous, attaque communautaire, attaque personnes touchées et surtout par rapport au VIH-Sida. Voilà ce que je pouvais dire à cet stade-là par rapport aux données probantes.
Merci, César. And it's always a pleasure to hear you speak so articulately about some of the challenges, particularly as far as they relate to communities that are often marginalized, stigmatized, discriminated against, underserved. I think it's really important as well in our guidance that this is something that is a core focus as we look, for us, what's really important in WHO, of course, is to drive approaches to health emergencies that are underpinned by equity and inclusion. And so evidence is an incredibly powerful mechanism for shifting and changing and making sure that our emergency processes make sure that resources get to underserved populations and their needs can be properly met and addressed. So really, really important to surface some of these key issues. I'm going to turn back to Patrick now for the question around the use of evidence. We've done quite a lot of work. There has been quite a lot of progress around this question that Kai related to in his opening remarks, which is how do you produce this evidence quickly enough in an emergency to get this to decision-making tables? It's a very different kind of evidence to a clinical trial that might take a really long time to produce results. Community evidence needs to be turned around really fast. We've made some progress with that. But how to make sure that evidence gets to the decision makers pay attention to that and actually use that to inform operational responses, I think is somewhere where we're seeing real challenges. So I'd like to hear from you about your experience about what works to increase the use of evidence so that responses really do start to become more tailored to meet communities' needs and to be developed in co-development with communities. Patrick, over to you for your thoughts and experiences.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina. And I would just want to highlight that it's very interesting because our initial steps for Toride or storytelling as an approach was on a WHO program, and it actually influenced local policies in the sense that we were looking at how can we use or how can we promote the use of new WHO guidelines on the treatment of malaria, which was, the idea was, there was new evidence that demonstrated that to properly treat malaria, especially in children under 5, it is important to do a test to confirm the cause of that fever. And then secondly, if you diagnose that it's simple malaria, you should put them on an oral treatment for 3 days. So it's a whole set of different systematic reviews and guidelines that were developed by WHO. And we wanted to promote that use. And so what we started doing was actually to communicate this guidance through training healthcare workers in how to use guidelines. And in the process, we realized that we're increasing the asymmetry of knowledge. So we're actually getting the doctors to know more and the people not knowing enough. So we decided that the best approach would probably be to convert these guidelines into stories and then communicate these stories to people. And in the process of telling these stories to the people, we open up for them to give us real-time lived experiences with malaria, with taking injections, so we're able to understand the community better. So we took back these lived experiences to the local government, and we highlighted to them that this is the reason why the people keep demanding for injections and do not want to do the test. So it was actually easier for them to respond faster because this was data that they could connect with. They could see that it's coming from people from their constituency. They were able to react. So that is one thing that can really help us to get real-time ethical data. But the question of speed is something else. And I think the question of speed, to look at the question of speed, it will have to be for us to work on all these indigenous ways or these local ways or these context relevant ways, just like what Caroline was talking about and what Cesar was talking about, and see how we can develop them. So within this guidance document, we can have this kind of good examples that actually show how local data, real-time data that has been collected in an ethical fashion, in a way that we respect that community, can be used. And this will mean that this kind of forums is a very good start. We are able to bring in speakers from different geographic regions, but we need to go beyond just that. We need these speakers to start connecting with each other, talking with people from First Nations in Canada, talking to the Yanning communities in Australia, talking to different parts to identify these methods, because the current methods that we use to generate evidence that we are all aware of is also a local method, but that's coming from the European perspective, for example. So we need to understand that just like these European perspectives could influence in our context, it's also possible that the storytelling can also influence even in the European perspective. So we could begin to think about how can we invest in developing these methods. Once we develop these methods, well, the speed will also increase, and we're going to be able to find shortcuts to still provide high quality evidence. And this brings us to ideas around thinking about where are all these epistemologies, or where are all these methods at their potentials or their capabilities. So maybe they are still just dormant. Maybe they are struggling to have a voice in the global space of research. Maybe they are struggling to get legitimacy. At some point, if we're able to overcome all of this, we can have sovereignty from data. That data can increase in speed, and then we'll be able to actually speak from a point of confidence when we talk to policymakers, or when we talk to people, or when we talk to practitioners. So this would be the contributions I can bring at this point. Thank you.
Fantastic, Patrick, very, very insightful. And I think what also strikes me listening to you is the critically important role that your organization played in that example you gave of brokering that space from community data to decision-making tables. And I think that's a critically important piece that perhaps we do need to look at a little bit more closely as well, to how to facilitate that. Caroline, I'm going to come to you with a similar but sort of slightly more targeted question, which is really, what do you see as the key gaps and needs that this guidance should address from your perspective?
I definitely have to build off of what Patrick said. I think just even how we think of data and information and how we validate that information. And I think frequently when we have studies that happen, a lot of times it's studies that are not done by our community members, not centering our community response. And so I loved what Patrick had said, that you actually translate that into stories to make sense for the communities that you actually represent. And I think for us, when we're talking about what gaps exist and what things that can we do, it's how we frame information, how we frame data, things that we wouldn't even in our academic sense or in our westernized approach of how we look at research and what does that mean from that context, even how we validate what those processes are, right? So, and talking about the epistemologies of how do we see information, how do we see that, and we often talk about what's in our blood memory, right? Things that have lived from generation to generation, passed down through oral story, and none of those things appear to be valid through our ways of science and our ways, but you know, it really is a lived science. You know, so we've, as Indigenous peoples in Canada, from our experience, have lived through multiple crises and multiple disasters and multiple ways of looking at this. And so, you know, we've often referred to, saying we're resilient, and we've actually started to move beyond resilient to say sometimes we're actually resistors. We're resistors to things that don't make sense to us. So we have to resist it. And move beyond even more of a strength conversation, instead of saying, well, we're resilient to it and we've survived it. It's no, we're resistant to it. And that's why we continue to exist, because our knowledges continue to pass forward. We're at a struggle stage though, because a lot of those things were lost and validated. And I will give an example from us. One of the things we learned from going through, of course, everybody in the COVID crisis, what we really learned through that social isolation period and that social period, how much culture is healing to us. And a lot of times in that research, and culture is treatment, what we don't realize is a lot of the things that were removed from many of our communities who are experiencing trauma at multiple forms, through, you know, colonial processes and different things in our histories of what have happened to us, that we often don't think about the impacts of that for generations to come. And those were the things that our community members struggled with the most. So one of the things that we did based on the evidence we had is we actually structured two traditional healing and wellness. We've created a traditional healing to train a next set of generation of traditional healers in our communities, to have a mentoring and role modeling approach to that, so that we have enough capacity in our communities to continue to move that forward. And I think what happened in a lot of this context that we have of different experiences in place right now, we don't tend to validate those as much as we should. But yet when crises really hit the wall and we were really feeling that, those were the things that we gravitated to the most. Our ceremonies, our ways of how we gather as a community, our ways of how we support each other, our traditional stories, our ways of our own languages and how to describe things in our own languages. And, you know, we'll often hear from our communities, well, I don't know how to describe that in English, right? But we have a way of describing that means so much more meaningful to us than if I were to try to describe this to you in English, right? And being able to do that. And I think, you know, from that perspective and being able to look at that is, how do we now ensure there's a space for those types of dialogues? And we also have created our first ever, probably the closest you would think of it is a pharmacy technician who produces medicines. We actually now have a traditional medicine pharmacist who knows how to compound our own traditional medicines. So being able to actually look at compounding our own medicines, and these were things that people really looked to as trusted evidence, as ways to support your own healing and wellness during times of crisis. And so that was evidence that came to us very loud and clear, saying there are better things that we need to do to support our communities more than the evidence is telling us at a world perspective of what's happening for writ large on how the response is for COVID. So those were cues that we had to actually take from our communities to inform that evidence. So that's just an example from some of the things we had to learn from our own perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You're giving us so much food for thought as we unpack some of these and surface some of the critically important issues we need to think about as we move forward with this guidance. I want to come to Cesar just for a final question and then open the floor for feedback from participants as well as your questions. So please do put your questions in the Q&A function so that we can respond to those. But Cesar, a final question to you. As we move forward with this guidance, what are some of the risks around evidence that we should be concerned with and thinking about? What are some of the key considerations we need to build into the guidance for the many, many stakeholders who will be producing evidence in an emergency? Over to you, Cesar.
Et merci beaucoup. La première chose que je voulais de dire, c'est qu'est-ce que les directives doivent insister sur? Les directives doivent insister sur le consentement éclairé. Nous savons que lorsque nous travaillons dans les situations d'urgence où le temps est compté, le consentement éclairé pour les participants, c'est très important. Et je pense que les directives doivent insister sur ça. Deuxième chose, les directives doivent insister sur la protection des données, la confidentialité, la sécurité des données, en particulier pour les informations sensibles des personnes qui sont affectées. Vous savez, avec l'avènement des COVID et de l'Mpox, nous avons senti qu'il y a certaines personnes qui sont stigmatisées parce qu'elles sont touchées par telle maladie, mais aussi parce ils appartiennent à un certain groupe. Par exemple, les professionnels des sexes, par exemple, les hommes qui ont les rapports sexuels avec les hommes, par exemple, les personnes vivant avec le sida. Donc, c'est important que les directives puissent insister sur la protection des données des participants, la confidentialité et comment ces données-là vont être gérées. C'est aussi important que les directives puissent mettre l'accent sur la vulnérabilité. Il faut qu'il y ait une attention particulière puisse être accordée à la population vulnérable, que ce soit les enfants, que ce soit les personnes âgées, que ce soit, comme je disais, les professionnels des sexes, les personnes vivant avec les VIH, ou aussi les hommes qui ont les rapports sexuels avec les hommes, ou la communauté LGBT. C'est important que les directives puissent insister sur ça. Bien sûr que nous sommes dans le monde d'urgence, mais c'est important d'insister sur cette approche éthique. Mais aussi, pour nous, les directives doivent donner les rôles et responsabilités clairs. Les directives doivent définir clairement les rôles des parties prenantes. C'est toujours important que les parties prenantes et les communautés soient au centre. Vous savez, lorsque vous produisez des données probantes, les données-là ne viennent pas seulement confirmer ce que la communauté ressent, mais ces données-là viennent aussi bouleverser les mal agis de la communauté. Il y a la façon où la communauté fait. Cette façon-là peut être mauvaise, mais lorsque les données probantes arrivent, ça met un choc dans la tête de la communauté. Et si cette communauté-là, il ne joue pas un rôle dans le processus de la production de ces données-là, la communauté va penser que vous, les scientifiques, vous avez amené un résultat pour faire ce que vous voulez. Alors que les résultats, là, ça vient de la communauté. C'est toujours important de définir les rôles et responsabilités des parties prenantes, mais que les communautés puissent prendre la partie dans toutes les étapes de la recherche, parce que c'est très important. Oui, vous parlez de données probantes. Vous venez par exemple dans ma communauté. Nous avons l'habitude de manger à terre. Vous venez nous dire que non, voilà, du fait de manger à terre, vous avez telle maladie. Et ce n'est pas facile pour nous d'accepter de refuser de manger à terre parce que nous sommes habitués à manger à terre. Mais alors que les données nous montrent que c'est en mangeant à terre que nous avons des maladies. Donc, pour accepter cette donnée-là facilement, si nous ne sommes pas dans les processus, nous ne participons pas dans les processus de l'enquête, nous allons douter de ces données-là. C'est pour ça que c'est très important dans les directives que les rôles et responsabilités soient bien définis, que les communautés soient au centre et que les informations soient partagées que ce soit partagé dans toutes avec les parties prenantes. Et que aussi dans les directives, qu'on puisse avoir clair sur les mécanismes de la coordination. Il faut vraiment un mécanisme de la coordination sur la plateforme pour faciliter la coordination et la collaboration entre des acteurs. Si ces choses-là sont mises dans les directives et qu'on met l'insistance sur ça, en mettant la communauté au centre, nous pensons que les directives va avoir un impact positif et que ça va avoir l'adhésion de la communauté. Mais revenons maintenant à ce qui concerne les données. À mon avis, il faut que les communautés participent dans toutes les étapes d'une étude, que ce soit en urgence, que ce soit en temps normal. Il faut que les communautés, c'est-à-dire les personnes pour lesquelles vous voulez faire l'enquête, il faut que les représentants soient dans l'étude. Parce que les données, c'est pour eux. Les données seront utilisées pour eux. Et la communauté est mieux placée de faire les plaidoyers, de toucher les dirigeants pour que les choses changent facilement. Et notre exemple, par exemple, lorsque nous avons les données que nous sommes stigmatisés dans les milieux des soins, nous faisons le bruit, nous allons voir le ministre de la Santé, nous allons voir les programmes. Voilà, dans les milieux des soins, nous sommes touchés, nous sommes stigmatisés. Et que vous devez former vos gens à terme des droits humains. Nous, la communauté, nous pouvons être avant-gardistes de l'utilisation des données probantes que les scientifiques produisent. Et pour que nous puissions être en avant, nous devons participer dans toutes les étapes. Que ces données-là ne viennent pas tomber dans la communauté comme ça vient d'ailleurs. Que nous puissions sentir que oui, sincèrement, ces données que nous avons, ça vient de la communauté, ça vient de nous. Et que nous devons accompagner ces changements pour que nous puissions avoir un comportement ou nous puissions avoir une autre façon de faire. Voilà un peu en résumé ce que nous passons par rapport aux directives, ce que nous passons par rapport aux données, que ce soit données probantes. Les données probantes, ce n'est pas les données des données des laboratoires. Les données probantes, c'est des données qui vont venir pour nous aider dans notre communauté à changer telle ou telle chose. Et si ça tombe du ciel, si ce sont seulement les scientifiques, nous, on considère comme si quelqu'un vient nous tromper parce qu'ils ont fait leur truc là-bas pour nous tromper. Non. Donc, il faut que nous soyons impliqués, pas d'une manière symbolique. Voilà ce que je pouvais ajouter dans ce que vous m'avez posé.
Merci beaucoup, César. Thank you so much. You've given us a huge amount to think about there. I'm very mindful of the time. And I'd like to hand over to Supriya to just take us through a very short piece that'll just elicit some of your feedback from the floor. Also noting somebody made a comment in the chat around recording, and in our closing remarks, we'll say a little bit more about what's the next step following this consultation. And we've also seen there's one or two questions in the chat that we will get to. But thank you very much to all of our panelists. And Supriya, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Nina. And now we've heard from our wonderful speakers. We've heard some very wise words coming in there about what is evidence, how to get evidence from the community. Now it's time for us to hear from you, all of you in the audience there, the participants. And the first question I'd like you to answer is give in one word, what do you think about when you talk about community evidence in public health? So please join us at slido.com 1496717. I'll just take a second. So I see the words coming. Experience, communication. Just 5 people. We'd like to hear from more of you. This is the webinar where we really like CSO perspectives, not just from the expert speakers, but from all of you. All of you. So So, and this will also help inform that your perspectives.
Mm.
Slido one which is again slido.com. Which aspect of using it? Oh, my apologies. Yeah, can you hear me now? My apologies. I didn't realize the microphone was not on.
Okay.
So, some more participants, please. I see resource time constraints are the biggest challenges, then analyzing evidence to interventions, getting buy-in from leadership partners, collecting evidence. Great. As I mentioned, this is your views and your responses are very, very important to us. Due to the constraints of the webinar, unfortunately, we can't get all your views, but we would like to hear from you on the chat through the Slido. And if you write to us at epi-win.com. So I'll stop here, but I'll leave the Slido open because on the constraints of time, we'd like to answer the questions as well and hand over to Nina for the question answers.
Thanks so much, Cypria. And it's great to get this little touch taste on your views and your thoughts. As Cypria said, we very much would like to hear from you. And there are a number of ways that we can continue this conversation beyond the webinar. And we will make this clear as we close. I'm mindful we have 4 minutes left. We would like to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to at least one of the questions that are coming through. So I'm going to ask Patrick, could you make some comments on this question around engaging children in community-based evidence? I think it's a really important question. How do you work with children in these contexts?
So thank you very much. So I found this quite an interesting question because we worked with children in a conflict zone in Cameroon around gender-based violence. So when there is conflict, gender-based violence tends to escalate. And we also found out from the work that we did that there's also increased risk of other emergencies, creating the polycrisis. So when there is conflict, you have a high chance that Mpox or even Ebola can spread faster in those communities because systems and services are all broken. So the concrete example that we had working with children in the community was gathering children's experiences. So we started by actually telling them a story on gender-based violence. So this story helps them to understand exactly what gender-based violence is, because the whole idea about communication is actually increasing the knowledge so that this can influence intention and behavior subsequently. So through a simple song which told a story of children and their private parts, these children were talking about what are the different types of gender-based violence that they could suffer and what they will do if it happens to them. So this helps in two ways. It increases the knowledge of the child, but it also increases the or deters the perpetrator, the potential perpetrator, because they know all the children know about this. So this was a very huge program that went beyond the conflict zone into other schools in Cameroon where children were actually singing this song. Now, let's look at the part of collecting the data, because I think as some of the panelists have mentioned, even in the perspective of Africa, the knowledge keepers are the researchers and the knowledge keepers are the storytellers. So these are two people who come together as one. And what this tells us is that you could not have completed your research if that information did not get to people, not just to policymakers, not just to practitioners, but to people. Because those people are the ones who will decide, do we want to use that policy that is coming, that's informed by evidence? No, I don't know that evidence, so I'm not interested. So the key thing is that storytelling can actually reach people and facilitate an evidence-based approach actually being rolled out. And this is the experience that we had with children. So in the process of the children actually singing this song, they come back to us and tell us what has been their experience in the community when they were singing the song. So you would see that over time, before we started the project, we were using something we call red stories and green stories. So when we talk to kids, you will get red stories from kids, where kids are telling you that, yes, somebody touched me inappropriately. This is just a short example. But then 3 months down the road, we get fewer red stories and we get more of what we call green stories, which is like, yes, someone wanted to touch me inappropriately, but I told them that I was going to report to the quarter head, that's the traditional leader, and the person stayed off. So this is now a green story. And over time, you have evidence of change in behavior, evidence of change in knowledge that is actually coming from stories that you are gathering from lived experiences. And then we could use this to argue or to advocate a case at the level of the district health service. So this is my experience with gathering information from children and the ethical and some ethical components around it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That is a fantastic example, very, very clear. And I think, as we build out this guidance, I think it'll be important for us to build in some of those case study examples to really illustrate to people, what it is that we are working with, what is it that this guidance is intended to shape and inform, the kind of practice that we would see this guidance influencing. I'm mindful of time, and I'm also very mindful of questions related to, how is this process unfolding? So I'll say one or two words to that, and then I'm going to hand over to Nedret to make any closing remarks as we close this webinar series. But as WHO develops guidance, we have a very well worked out process for doing that. So unsurprisingly, we also base our guidance on evidence. We always start with what is known on a topic. And in this area, there are a lot of internationally recognized ethics standards related to good practice, less so in this field, less so in community data, the use of social and behavioral sciences to inform practice, more so in the biomedical spaces. But we work with that, and then we also work with a number of technical expert groups. We have consultations such as this one. So this is one step in the road. It's definitely not the end of the process. We will be documenting some of the key outcomes of this discussion. We will invite you as well to complete a survey. We have a short survey link that we'll put in the chat so that we can hear from you. And there we'll also invite you, if you would like to stay engaged in this conversation, to please stay engaged with us. We are happy to share some of the draft content of the guidance to get your inputs, and again, to sort of have further workshopping to make sure that this work really meets your needs. But with that note, I'm going to hand over to Nedret to close the webinar and just express my sincere thanks to you all for staying on, and of course, to the panelists for your superb contributions. Nedret, over to you.
Thanks, Dina. I also thank all the panelists. I think that has been so rich and so important. We have to find a way to systematize this interaction, then try to find a way to create some of the community of practice, some collection of all these best practices, and then try to support you as much as we can on some standard procedures, norms, guidelines, tools, which of course we are very, very aware of the real importance it's in the context adaptation, adapting to the unique communities, adapting to that specific setting. And please help us. It's not a easy area, but we would want to seriously work with you, learn from your experience. And I think, as I said, it's just a start, and your input has been extremely valuable. So we are looking forward to further interaction, maybe making this group even broader, larger as we go by, and to be able to serve the communities in the best possible way. So thanks a lot, and thanks to the team also, Nina, you and Kai, under your leadership, the whole community protection and resilience unit working hard on that, including Supriya. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be close to you, to be close to the individuals, communities. That's where we can make all the difference. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nedret, and thanks, first of all, to everyone who's participated today in this second CSO webinar. We hope to continue engaging with all of you, with civil society organizations in future as well on a number of issues. I'd like to thank Nedret for making the time, in spite of a busy schedule, for supporting us in this. I'd like to thank Kai for his leadership, and Nina for her leadership in this area. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's worked in the background, the two Evas, Eva Niederberger and Eva Erlach, for this program, and to Project ECHO for supporting us with the webinar. Thank you very much. And this is just, as Nina said, this is just one step. We look forward to interacting with you again. And thank you to all the panelists. We look forward to continuing to work with you. And with this, wishing you a very good day and a great week ahead.